Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Wisconsin Icons. I am your host, Bob Dolan, and as always, I'm very grateful for your time and your enthusiasm about this video podcast. I appreciate everyone's support. Our early feedback has been overwhelmingly positive, and I am grateful to all of you for your interest. My icon today is a civil rights and a fair housing pioneer, a civil rights and a fair housing icon, legend, Vel Phillips. There is now a high school in Madison named after Vel Phillips. She was born in Milwaukee nearly 100 years ago, but her impact was largely everywhere in this state. There are inner city building murals created by young artists in their communities dedicated to Vel Phillips. So the acknowledgement of her gratitude and for her accomplishments continues now, several years after her passing. My title sponsor for all Wisconsin Icons episodes is the great team, the injury attorney team of Pasternak and Zergaville, award-winning injury attorneys, and their website is at www.injurywisconsin.com. Now, before I introduce my guest, I do ask for your patience for just a couple of seconds, as I hope to diffuse what could be, at least at first glance, a legitimate critique about this particular episode. As you know, my icon today, Vel Phillips, was Black. My guest today, my expert today on Vel Phillips, is white. Now, I do understand the temptation that some may have to immediately protest the fact that my guest for a iconic Black woman is a white woman. But let me briefly explain. I contacted several Black men and women who were either peers or friends of Vel Phillips, and they were all very gracious that I was reaching out to them. They were all very glad that we were dedicating an episode to this iconic figure. They all greatly admired Vel Phillips. They all greatly respected the legacy that she leaves behind. But all of them, to their credit, told me that they were not exactly experts on Vel Phillips, and they thought this episode should go to a person who could speak at length and with some depth about her story. And they all pointed me to the same person. I spoke to 4 people. They all pointed me to this one person who happens to be a young woman who is white. So that's the explanation for today's guest. I think, too, I did not know Vel Phillips. I wish I had. I'm certainly aware of her legacy. I'm certainly aware and impressed by her life. But I think, too, that in a way, the fact that a young white woman was so struck and so impressed and so intrigued by the legacy of Vel Phillips, that Vel would find that not only to be a compliment, but a huge tribute. So thanks for hearing me out. Let's get to the episode. Let's get to my icon, Vel Phillips. My guest is Abigail Nye, reference instruction archivist at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee Archives. Abby Nye, good morning to you and welcome to Wisconsin Icons. I'm thrilled to have you on to educate us all about Vel Phillips. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm intrigued before we walk through Vel's impressive life, I'm intrigued why Vel Phillips was even on your radar in the first place. I mean, you're 2 or 3 generations behind Vel Phillips, and yet there was something about her life or her example that must have stuck out or struck you. What was it?
That's a great question. I didn't grow up in Milwaukee, so I never had the opportunity to meet Vel in person, sadly. I started working in Milwaukee in 2014, which was just 4 years before her death, and by that time she was in poor health. so I started learning more about Vel as I taught students about Milwaukee civil rights history. And then Vel's papers were donated to the Wisconsin Historical Society in 2013, and then the collection was placed here in the art archives in 2016, I believe. So as I was starting to go through her papers, I really began to be drawn to her. It helped that she was 32 when she was first elected to the Common Council and had her first child. And, I was 32 when I had my son. And I sometimes wondered, what would it be like to be a young mother and dealing with the sleepless nights and then facing the men in the Common Council all alone. So she was just such an interesting person. And I think because of my sort of place coming to Milwaukee, I was really drawn to her.
Good. Let's bullet point her early life. She's born, she's a child of the Depression. And I always bring that up, Abby, because I do think no matter who we're talking about, it certainly impacts the rest of their life. So she's a child of the Depression, and she lives kind of just a normal life here in Milwaukee until perhaps her big moment in her youth would be Howard University, correct? How does that happen, and why was that so significant?
Yeah, absolutely. So Vel really, people started to take a little bit of notice of her in high school. So as a high school senior, she wanted to participate in the Elks. They had an oratorial contest. And she was initially disqualified because one of her teachers at North Division was a judge, and there was racial discrimination. So actually, some of her fellow students protested that and launched a petition. And then she was allowed to eventually participate, and she wrote a speech called The Negro and the Constitution, and she won that contest.
Hmm.
And that gave her a full scholarship in 1942 to attend Howard University.
How, I'm just guessing here, but you just said 1942. She's 1,000 miles away from Howard University. Um, even that accomplishment of a scholarship to Howard must have meant that a lot of people had taken notice of her, because that can't happen all the time where Howard reaches out to somebody here in Milwaukee.
Yeah, I think she had the opportunity to choose where she went, and she chose Howard. And I think there's probably a little bit of I'm going to go and explore what the world is like outside of Milwaukee.
Mm-hmm. Does something, Abby, occur at Howard that perhaps lights a fuse that we would see later in her life?
That's a great question because, I was actually looking at her yearbook page from Howard University, and she at that point was saying that she wanted to be a psychiatric social worker.
Hmm.
She was studying psychology, and we get kind of glimpses of her potential interests in high school. She actually kind of was reminiscing in one of her notebooks and talks about a time where she, went in to meet with the high school guidance counselor. And she says the guidance counselor was like, okay, so I see you want to be a lawyer. And Vel's like, yes. She's like, that would require a lot of effort and study. Maybe you should pursue something more realistic. Your
Uh,
people are very good at cooking and sewing. And she's like, well, I don't like to cook and I'm not good at sewing. And so at that point, she kind of, that little bit of pushback from the
yeah.
guidance counselor kind of made her go, excuse me, I actually like want to do something like being a lawyer with my life. So yeah, I think she was considering social work at Howard University. She did some in Milwaukee, and I think quickly decided that it wasn't for her. And she decided that she wanted to make people's lives better through the law.
So she comes home, Abby, back to Wisconsin.
Hmm.
You've already mentioned the first two when she was at the age of 32, but she was a woman of firsts. She was the first to X, she was the first to Y, she was the first to Z. Walk us through those, please.
Yeah, it's a long list. So
Yeah.
she was the first African American female graduate of the UW-Madison Law School. She and her husband, Dale Phillips, were the first husband-wife lawyer team admitted to the bar. She was the first African American and woman on the Common Council, the first African American judge when she was appointed to the judge in the Milwaukee area. She was the first African American and woman Secretary of State in Wisconsin. So people call her a trailblazer, and they're not wrong.
I would think, though, we have to consider the timeline and the time period that she's doing all of these accomplishments. I would think that somewhere in that period, there had to be some pushback. There had to be some roadblocks. There had to be perhaps an unfair or even ugly incident or two. Is that correct? Because, she's still a young woman. She's a married woman. She has a child. She's a Black woman. I mean, it couldn't have been all a bed of roses.
Absolutely not. And one of the things I really admire about Vel is her persistence. Because it was not easy. She had so many things to deal with. I mean, she recalls in her the draft autobiography that was never published. But when she was most known, I would say, for the fight for open housing in Milwaukee.
Mhm.
And during that time, um, Henry Meyer, who was the mayor of Milwaukee at that time, she says he summoned me into his office and he basically told me that my housing bill was causing him big problems on the South Side and was costing him votes. And he said, my husband Dale should turn me over his knee and give me a good whipping.
Whoa. Wow.
And yeah,
Wow.
um, and somehow that kind of pushback from the mayor and all the
Yeah.
hate mail she was getting, that did not deter her.
Well, it probably, if anything, made her even more determined to do the
I
things.
would think so. That would make me more determined. I'd be like,
Absolutely.
I'll show you.
Yeah. You mentioned her husband, and you're the expert, but he played a pretty big role here, didn't he? In everything she did, he wasn't just okay, I'm going to be the husband, go do my thing, and you do. He was a great partner.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think Vel would be the first person to say that, their partnership was what made it possible for her to do her work. When she was kind of recalling her time with the open housing marches in Milwaukee in her autobiography draft, she says, if Dale got home before I did, he would pitch in and do the cooking, the dishwashing, setting the table, answering the phone, and getting our sons to help as well. And so he was really the reason that she was able to do a lot of these things.
Gee, I thought I was the only husband that did that. It's good to know. Civil rights, Abby, would be the big umbrella. But
Right,
underneath that umbrella, as you've already referred, perhaps her signature, her identity was in fair housing, open housing. So who
right.
did she
Yeah.
team with? What did they do? And more importantly, what did they accomplish?
Yeah. So, you know, she made fair housing her priority during her time on the Common Council. So she first, in 1962, introduced the city's first open housing ordinance. And it was voted down. She was the only person who voted for it. And she brought it back every year until 1967, so 5 years. And we have news footage of her saying, I will resubmit this. I will be back with the same ordinance in 90 days. And she kept going. But, at some point, it became clear that it was going to take a little bit more effort than just sort of making the case for it in the Common Council and making the case for it, informal community groups. So Father James Groppe, who was a Catholic priest in Milwaukee, and working with the NAACP Youth Council, comes to Vel and he's like, "Look, I've got this youth council. They want to do something. How can we help?" And so Vel and James Groppe team up, and the NAACP Youth Council starts leading these marches, and they march starting in August. Of course, now I'm going to forget. I think it was August 27th or 28th of 67, and they start marching. And the first two nights were very big. and there were a lot of counter protesters. It was very ugly. But they marched 200 nights
Mm.
through that cold Milwaukee winter into the spring. And Vel talks about, how she would finish up with the Common Council, run home, grab something to eat, and then run off to do the marches. And so, that really brought a lot of national attention to Milwaukee
Yeah.
and to the open housing struggle. And a lot of, publicity that Henry Meyer, the mayor, probably would not have liked. So there was kind of like that public pressure. And then, in April of '68, you have the passage of the Civil Rights Act. You have Martin Luther King's assassination, and then sort of all of those things together. Finally, at the end of April, the Common Council finally passed the open housing law.
Do you think, Abby, that because of all her positions, all her first to do X, Y, and Z, that she just kind of fell into civil rights and fell into open housing, or were these causes always just part of her DNA?
I would say that her high school essay, where she talks about, the Constitution, gives us a clue as to where her interests were. Um, and I do think that it was always there. It was just my impression is that she was at least in the early years just figuring out what that would look like.
Mm.
And law and sort of politics were the avenue that she found most helpful.
Abby, you began this research project, I assume, with a limited knowledge, a limited interest in Vel Phillips. Now the research is behind you. I mean, when you go around the state and the community educating people about Vel Phillips, what do you leave them with?
Ooh, what do I leave them with? That's a good
What do you
question.
want them to know about Vel Phillips that we can all learn from?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that I really appreciate about Vel, and I hope that other people appreciate about her as well, is the example she sets in fighting for justice. And I actually have on my cubicle wall here a screen print that with one of her quotes that says, "There are no longer excuses for inaction or delay." And I hope that when people learn a little bit about Vel Phillips and see what she fought for, that they come away as saying, okay, this is something that we can do.
Yeah.
She showed us some of the things that are possible. Um, and she was very aware of that as well. She talks about, kind of reflecting on her position. She says, being the only Black and only female member of the council, she says, meant I had to serve more than just those who elected me from the Sixth Ward. She said I had to represent all African Americans throughout the city, and to a great degree, all women as well. And she said, my fight was their fight, and their fight was my fight.
That's superb. That's superb. I wish we'd hear more of that sentiment these days.
Mhm.
Um, there seems, correct me if I'm wrong, but there seems to be, Bell passed 3 or 4 years ago.
Mhm.
There seems to be a greater appreciation for her accomplishments now after passing than perhaps even when she was still alive. Do you get that? Do you get that vibe?
That's hard for me to say as somebody who is a newcomer to Milwaukee. I
Mm-hmm.
will say she was certainly recognized as someone extraordinary in her lifetime. She was the first African American in the US elected to the National Committee of Democrats, and she was on a first name basis with JFK, Lyndon Johnson, Jimmy Carter. Um, but I do think that my generation and perhaps the generation that is after me, Gen
Yeah,
Z, I suppose, we need people to look to for examples. We live in a time that has a lot of challenges, and um, someone like Vel, I think we can appreciate even more, not only because, she was a really extraordinary woman who persisted against incredible odds during her own lifetime, but the the things that she fought for, still the things that we're fighting for today. And she provides us with some inspiration for the work that we do now.
Well, Abby, you are excellent. You do Vel proud to update and educate all of us on her life and her her legacy. I'm sorry, and I'm sure in your research you have gathered an impressive digital collection. Is that correct? And is it accessible to all of us?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things, and we can put the links in the show notes. There are a couple of things that your listeners may be interested in exploring. So first is our March on Milwaukee digital collection, and this is a larger digital collection that examines the fight for school desegregation and open housing in Milwaukee in the late 1960s primarily. And that's a really wonderful digital collection. If you're interested in exploring more about Vel Phillips, you certainly can look at materials there, but you can also look at a digital exhibit that I've put together about Vel Phillips, which will kind of go into more detail about a lot of the things that we talked about today. So you can find both of those links in the show notes, and you're always welcome to reach out to me or my archival colleagues with any questions you might have.
We will indeed. Abby, you've been a delight. You've been a great resource, and I greatly appreciate your time and your information about Vel Phillips on the Wisconsin Icons. You take care. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Have a great day.